All right, and we're live. Chillcast MMA, and I'm joined by Austin Brody of MMAPanic. And it's a little bit of a slow time right now. We're a little bit under 10 days before UFC 246. But as always, there's fights that have been announced, so we can talk about that. There's always some evergreen topics. We could talk about some of these promoters. We could talk about some of these fighters. So obviously, as always, there's a lot going on in the world of MMA. But before we get into any of that, Austin, what's going on? Just wanted to check in. How you been? What's up?
Yeah, I've been good. Like you said, it's been slow last few weeks for MMA, but news is finally starting to pick back up as far as like fight announcements and stuff. And they recently came out and announced that they're having a press conference with Cowboy and Connor next week. So that adds a lot of excitement to the fight week. So we have a lot to look forward to in 2019 and in this week that's coming up. So it should be fun.
Yep, and that's going to be on January 15th, so that's definitely going to be interesting. We all know there's going to be all eyes on that, just seeing how Conor McGregor approaches it after all this time. It's open to the public, I do believe, and it's also going to be interesting to see because Donald Cerrone has come out and made some comments saying that he doesn't believe Conor's going to go the low blow route. So if he does, how does Cerrone respond? All of that is up in the air, and I'm sure it'll be a major focal point heading into the fight. But like I said, there's always fights being announced. Some have already been announced for a little minute, so why not talk about it right now, at least touch on it a little bit. So the first one on the docket I want to talk about is taking place March 28th, 2020, UFC on ESPN 8. It's going to be the number 2 ranked heavyweight Francis Ngannou. He's taking on the number 5 ranked heavyweight Lorenzo Rosenstruck. So any thoughts on it? Like it, dislike it, keep moving? What do you think about it?
Yeah, I like it. I think it's a really fun, exciting fight on paper. It reminds me of the matchup that we got last year or 2 years ago between Derek Lewis and Francis Ngannou that we all were, sold on the fact that it was going to be this great fight that ended up, not being very good of a fight. But it's a good matchup, not just because, they're two of the biggest and most powerful fighters in the heavyweight division. They're both two of like the hottest fighters in the division as far as like their recent success and like their knockouts and what they've been able to do in their last few fights. So it's a good fight. In my opinion, I think it's a number 1 contenders matchup because Ngannou will be on a run, a very impressive run of knockouts if he's able to do it against Rosenstruck. And Rosenstruck will go from relatively unknown last year to, knocking out Overeem and Ngannou. So I think that puts him up there in contendership to fight the winner of DC and Stipe for no other reason than just there's really probably no one else out there.
UFC's heavyweight division has historically been thin, but I don't know if it's weird, right? Because on one hand, it's like when you got at light heavyweight this barren wasteland where there's just no one really to face John Jones. Guys get moved up. He knocks him down fast, and then they just sort of toil in anonymity for a while until they switch weight classes. So it's like at heavyweight, when we have a guy in Rosenstruck who is a fresh face, he sits at 10-0 overall, and he's 4-0 in the UFC. So you can clearly see he's just now really starting to get to it. And it's like my knee-jerk reaction is to disagree and say, yeah, that makes a hell of a lot of sense. But at the same time, I don't really know because I don't want him to get up there with a DC or a Stipe and get single leg or high crotched, and then we just see, all right, he really wasn't ready for it. So, like Derek Lewis, like I, wanted him to take that opportunity at the time against Daniel Cormier on short notice. But, now that it's all said and done, what did he really gain from that other than a paycheck? So it's just interesting, but nonetheless, that is going to be an interesting matchup. And I got to think for Francis Ngannou, he was a little ticked, so I guess I'll ask you that as a follow-up. Do you agree with Francis? Should he be annoyed that he has to actually take this fight?
Yeah. I mean, I understand. I think he's done enough. Like, he's done enough in the streak that he's on to warrant a title shot. I definitely believe that. But I mean, I don't blame the UFC for doing the trilogy between DC and Stevie. I mean, DC's on his way out, and we want to know. They're one apiece. We want to know who's going to get the better of him. So I understand his frustration, but I mean, he gets a big fight, another chance to test himself. I guess he's looking at it in the aspect of like I have a lot more to lose in this fight with this relatively unknown guy than to gain. But if he looks impressive, I mean that just uh, adds to his stock and makes people want to see him fight Stipe again. So or DC. So we'll see. But I understand his him being annoyed at this situation.
Yeah, I tend to agree with him. I mean, he's on a 3 fight win streak at heavyweight, which is, I mean, you can say what you want about the actual number, but at heavyweight, that is impressive. And it's over guys like Curtis Blades, JDS, and Cain Velasquez. So, I mean, his resume is actually, I think it's more impressive now than it was before he got his first title shot, in my personal opinion. So I tend to agree with him, but I also can understand, like, if DC is talking about retirement, that talk is floating out there. And Stipe, he's talked about wanting to get some big paydays out there. And the Brock fight walked away, and John Jones, he seemed like he was you know interested in it when it was Brock, not so much now that it's Stipe. So I can understand why he would clearly want to see what's up with the rubber match with DC. So for Francis, it just seems like we've seen this time and time again, right? He's the third man out. But I do think if he can go in there and pick up a nice W over Yarinzo, I mean, it just keeps his name in the queue. So I do like it from that perspective. But the second fight I wanted to talk about, this one taking place at Bantamweight, and it's going to be this is also taking place at UFC on ESPN 8, and it's going to be the number 5 ranked Rafael Assunção. He's taking on the number 9 ranked Cody Garbrandt. So it's been a while since we've seen either one of these guys, especially Garbrandt. So any interest in this fight? Like it, dislike it, keep it moving? What are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting fight. It's a top ranked fight. It's a dangerous fight for Garbrandt, who is coming off of 3 knockout losses in a row. I know Sunsao doesn't possess like maybe the knockout power and the way that his last opponents did, but it's a top ranked guy. I thought maybe he would come back with a more favorable matchup to kind of gain back some momentum, but he's fighting one of the top guys right away. So I mean, it's going to be interesting to see where his mindset's at if he tries to fight safer and more precise, or if he gets drawn into wild exchanges again. So it'll be interesting to see more so on the side of Cody Garbrandt than a Sunsao, just to see where his head's at and how he performs with 3 knockout losses in a row.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that point. That to me, that's definitely the biggest question heading into that one with Garbrandt. Has he actually settled down? It's like it just makes you think, and maybe it's a little bit of a reach on my part, but I just tend to think like with Alpha Male and all that, were they just training him to sort of get revenge at TJ and Dominic Cruz, or was he being properly developed? Because you just go back and look at it, and it's like we see times where guys get completely rushed to the top, right, and they face plant. But I feel like the flip side of that is when you're successful and then you eventually do lose, you were in such a rush mode where you just back to back to back, and even Nate Diaz has said historically, and other fighters as well, can't really develop when you're just training to take fights constantly. So did he maybe stunt his growth a little bit to where he was so locked in on just this specific style where he was going 100 miles an hour that now that he's hit a road bump, it's hard for him to adjust on the fly. So maybe that's why you do see 3 knockout losses in a row. I'm just sort of thinking out loud on that one with Garbrandt because this is interesting. You never really see guys go from extremely hot to extremely cold in the fashion that he has done. So I agree with you, and that was just something I wanted to throw out there. So any thoughts to me saying that, or ready to move on?
Yeah, I agree, and that's what it looks like from like just looking at the fact that how he performed against Cruz and then his last 3 fights. But I think he's very just skill wise, he's very talented. He might be the most talented guy in the division. Like we see how fast his hands is, the way he's able to move. That fight with Dominic Cruz was a masterpiece, but I think sometimes his mentality gets the better of him, where he gets drawn, especially with the TJ, where there was all that bad blood that he just got drawn into these these wild exchanges where he doesn't really have the chin to back up mentality at times, and I think that's what's kind of cost him. I think if he's smart and just uh, picks his shots and uses his counters and stuff like that, I think he can beat most of the guys in the division. It's just these last three fights, his opponent's been able to draw him into this dogfight where he'll exchange, especially in his last fight with Perez, where like I mean that was ridiculous. There was like 2 minutes solid of them just throwing wild punches at each other until somebody dropped, and that's Garbrandt playing just a 50-50 game, whereas he could just use his talent and use his speed and all his skills to get the victory. So that's why I think it is. But what you said made a lot of sense too.
Yeah, so again, those two fights are going down March 28th, 2020, and it's just going to be interesting to see with Garbrandt, like, how does he actually come back? But nonetheless, again, those fights are going down UFC on ESPN 8, March 28th, 2020. So I guess another thing that I wanted to touch on that I just saw, another small story I saw floating out there, Ryan Hall, he had somewhat of a call out, not really saying that he wants to fight either Frank Yeager or Jose Aldo. So first, I do want to get your thoughts on that. Who would you actually pick? Do you think he even deserves those names? We can get into that, but then just sort of, I guess, like sort of branch the conversation out just a little bit. And the guy, his last fight was a win over Darren Elkins, and he was able to pick up a W over guys like Gray Maynard and BJ Penn. And he's looked impressive, and I do believe he's undefeated in the UFC, but we rarely get to see the guy. And he's been vocal every time that we hit this low with him where he has to say something about it. We realize, like, oh, snaps, he's been healthy. He just hasn't been booked. So I'll just throw it back to you. Is there anything to that? Is that on him? Is that on guys not stepping up? Is that on the UFC/ESPN? But before you answer that, what do you actually think about him calling out Jose Aldo or Frank Yeager? Of those two, which one do you like more?
For him, I like the matchup with probably either would be good for him, but I would say Frank Yeager is coming off of well, I don't know. Actually, I'd probably go with Aldo because he's coming off of a lot of momentum. But Aldo's doing his thing at 35, and I don't think he want to do that. So I would say Frank Yeager. But yeah, what you're saying is true. Like we don't see very much of him, but we hear every time he talks, he says how healthy he is, that he's looking to fight, and I don't think it's the UFC not wanting to get him fights. I think he's a very tricky matchup, man. Like like you said, he's undefeated in the UFC. He's a specialist in what he does, like with the leg locks and stuff. It's crazy. So at the very best, you're gonna have a very frustrating fight against him. So I don't think a lot of people are jumping at the opportunity to fight Ryan Hall, which is what he's said. So I think that alone, along with his wins, kind of warrants him step up in competition. Because like, what do you do if where he's at, the his peers won't fight him? So yeah, I'm all for it. Like you said, I want to see more of them. I think everyone does, and I think the UFC knows that. So I don't think that they're against them. I think it's not a lot of fighters are willing to fight him because of that how tricky of a matchup he is.
Yeah, and he's officially ain't won an MMA in 4-0 in the UFC to date. So it's like you can clearly see the guy he's up there. He's trying to get his name out there. For me personally, I just feel like if we're talking about just style wise, I like the fight with Frank Yeager more so than Jose Aldo, just because God forbid, and we all know how Jose Aldo and they talk about, how he has great hip work. God forbid if he hits a sprawl on Ryan Hall and he can't do anything. I do not like his chances there. With Frank Yeager, I feel like he can bait him a little bit more into a grappling exchange, and who knows what can happen from there. That's just in my opinion. But if we're just talking about name wise, who's the bigger, more relevant name? Obviously, it would be Jose Aldo. I mean, clearly he thinks so because in his Instagram post, which he made on this past Tuesday, he put a picture of um, Jose Aldo in it. So it's like clearly that's where his head is. But that's going to be interesting to see. And I guess on the matchmaking thing, I think it is a little bit of both. I think it's a little bit of he has to play the game a little bit, and I also think it's a mix of guys they're not lining up to fight this guy. I believe that. I mean, it was weird when I saw him get a fight with Gray Maynard. That was just one of those ones where I'm like, the matchmaking of that is so awkward that I have to think that wasn't their first idea when they thought, hey, we got this guy that's on the come up. Let's give him Gray Maynard. Like, to me, that was just weird. And then his momentum after the BJ Penn fight, it's like we had to fight BJ Penn. God knows where he is in his career at this point. So it's just, I don't know who to necessarily blame it on. Like, I guess if he was a little bit louder, it would work. But we've had conversations about that, so I don't need him compromising on his morals. But then at the same time, guys aren't lining up to fight him. So what do you do? But it is a tricky situation, and again, that's going to be interesting to see what they do with him moving forward. And again, as always, you can find me on Twitter at Nixon_speaks. You can find Austin at MMAPanic. But I did want to sort of open up the conversation a little bit. Since this is the showcast, we could just sort of talk about these sort of evergreen, sort of random topics. One that I guess I was sort of trying to draft up. Just had some fun with this one. Why not? So we all know ESPN, they do the 30 for 30 series. It's a documentary series where they document some of the most iconic, for better or for worse, moments in sports. Some might have, some popular, some not so much. And for MMA, they did the Chuck and Tito one, which was like, okay, guys. But nonetheless, that's for a whole different day. So I just wanted to ask, if you had to, say ESPN comes to you, or just you're in that position and you have to sit down and think of a 30 for 30 topic, for you, what would it be?
Probably Pride. Just the inner workings of Pride, and like its ties to like whatever it was tied to, and like all like the crazy stuff with the contracts and the wild freak show fights and all of that stuff. I would want to see like an in-depth documentary series on just Pride.
Yeah, that's a good one. That will be interesting because, like if you're familiar with the 30 for 30 thing, that would be interesting just to see who they interview, like who's going to actually be the one to go on wax and open up about some of the real. And then also, like, knowing them, 30 for 30s, man, especially if you watch the OJ Made in America one, they go deep. So, like, I imagine they would have to get into some of the Yakuza stuff. And if it's truly off limits, then, like, how deep does that go? So, that's a damn good one. Like, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about just the possibilities of them even trying to set that up. Like, me thinking about that alone is giving me the chills. So that's a damn good one. I guess I'll just throw it back to you. What, like, attack that one a little bit more. Like, that's interesting. Break that down for me. Like, what's your vision on that?
Kind of just based on what you're saying, like, so I don't think we've ever like. Well, obviously we've seen the fights and we've heard like the stories and some like backstage videos that came out, but it would just be awesome to get one person to get all these people together and tell the story of like what was going on and how shady it really was, and like what you're saying, all the stuff that went into like what went into convincing like Nogueira to fight Bob Sapp, or like some of these crazy freak show fights where like a 500-pound dude fights a 135-pound guy. Like what goes into that, and the most interesting part is, like you said, it's going to be what their actual ties with the Yakuza or whatever it was. Like that's the most interesting thing, to see how deep that connection went, and how crazy it was. That that's the kind of the spark that ignited MMA, along with what the UFC was doing. But that was like the first organization that showed MMA on like in stadiums and in arenas, and like made it look like larger than life, and like this big presentation that still is kind of lacking in some MMA today. So I just think like just all around almost every thing about Pride was interesting and not told in detail that much.
Yeah, and there is literature out there on it, and obviously, if you've seen some other MMA documentaries, you are aware of some of the aspects of it, and some fighters have come out and given stories. But if we're just talking about like a deep dive on something that's like, I know the fans would truly appreciate, that's definitely up there. For me, for me, I've said this before, but I'm still gonna stick to it. I would love to see a 30 for 30 on the man, the myth, the legend, Lorenzo Fertitta. Like, just so much. We've heard so many stories about the UFC and so many truths and lies, and even recently we got on Dana about the whole we want Cerrone. It's crazy how the fans are disrespecting Cerrone or whatever he said, and then Cerrone gets cut from the ad, and like, so we've seen weird stuff like that with Dana. But as far as Lorenzo, he's the one that I feel like there's just a lot of questions about the business part of it. Like, I think back to the ESPN interview he did about fighter pay. Given what we know now, like, I would love to see him face relatively the same line of questions about it. Like, what are his thoughts on it? And just go from there. What role did he actually play with some of these fighter contracts? Why did he choose to sell when he did? Who were some of the other suitors to buy the UFC? And if we're going to talk about mob stuff, with him it's a little bit more like we can't say that for certain, but I mean, you can find some sort of literature out there on the Fertitta family, and I would like an official, like, no more cloak and dagger stuff. If we're gonna put something on wax, I would love to see like an official, like, what do people mean when they say Fertitta and the mob? Like, I have an idea based on some loose articles I've seen, but a detailed analysis of him and everything that entails it, to me, that's another one that's riveting. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that would be very interesting. I mean, the company that and the guy that was the one that made MMA like marketable and successful, and to see like we were saying with Japan, like how deep do their ties go to stuff like that. It would be the same thing goes with the Fertitta brothers. So yeah, I think there's a ton of topics untouched in the MMA world that you could do a 30 for 30 type documentary on. And I think once the sport gets bigger and stuff, and now that's on ESPN, I think they're gonna be way more inclined to do that kind of stuff. So I think we're gonna start seeing it. But uh, I watched the Chuck and Tito 30 for 30. I liked it, and it was cool to see MMA and 30 for 30. But like either one of the topics we just said, I would have rather seen than the Chuck and Tito thing, because we've seen most of that in that Bad Blood series that came out for UFC years ago. So it was cool that they made one MMA, but I would have picked a different topic other than Chuck versus Tito.
Yeah, it just feels like, I mean, come on, we could just sit, we could go on and on trying to think of topics that would be a lot more interesting. And hey, I'm sure that they have other people. I'm sure that was probably just the first of many. So don't want to sit here and downplay it like that. But it's just interesting. And again, just a evergreen topic, just something that, again, it's a little bit slow in MMA. So why not talk about these fun little offhand topics like that? But I guess before we move on, if I had to say, like, what will be another one where I'm like, what's the full story on it, basically, which is basically what we're asking here, or the general gist of this convo. I would love to know. I think it was UFC 167, or basically when Vitor Belfort fought John Jones. There was an email that was not supposed to get released to the public that's alludes to Dana White or someone at the UFC knowing that Vitor Belfort popped hot heading into that fight. But obviously, he still fought, and we all know that John Jones still, and he's alluded to it in interviews in the past, that he still sort of feels weird that they knew Vitor popped hot and was still allowed to fight. And we know he almost got submitted in that one, and his arm, he said, it is still kind of tweaked to this day. So to me, and we can sort, I mean, for a 30 for 30, that would be ironic that John Jones would sort of be the victim of PED use in some ways. So I guess that would be sort of the irony of the whole thing. But to me, I want to hear the full story on that, like, because that did happen. So I want, hey, get a budget and dig deeper.
I never even thought about it like that, but yeah, that is something that happened, and John Jones was mad about that for a really long time. I'm sure he still is. So that would be an interesting take too, because like you said, John Jones being the victim of PED use, and that kind of would give him an excuse to be like, well, if they're okay with him doing it, then why shouldn't I do it too? So yeah, that there's almost nothing you could do that would be uninteresting at this point. But Uh, so yeah, I look forward to seeing the ones they do in the future. Hopefully they cover some really cool topics other than just like these two didn't like each other.
Yeah, leave that to SB Nation. And that's not a dig. SB Nation actually does a really good series on YouTube where they go on some of the beefs. You know, it's a series they do football and basketball, but they have been adding MMA. They recently, I do believe it was Rhonda and if it wasn't Amanda News, it was Holly Holm. I haven't watched it, but I saw that they did post it on my watch later list. But I mean, so that's if you want that type of content, leave that to them because it's a great series and it's free. Like I don't need a production on he said this or Kevin Lee and Michael Chiesa got into a beef. Like don't no don't waste my time. But moving forward, we know UFC 246 that's going down soon, and as always, there are some small topics. There are some more fight announcements going on, so I guess I'll just leave it to you. Is there anything under the radar that you want to touch on at all? Do you want to talk about some more of these fight announcements?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I haven't read too much into it, but have you been seeing what's going on with Jessica Penne and USADA, where they've kind of like forced her into retirement because of a medication she has to take because of low levels of hormones or something to that extent? Have you seen anything about that?
No, I have not seen that. I was catching up on Ryan Hall and like another fight that I want to talk about later, so I completely missed that. What is going on with that?
Yeah, I just seen it on her Instagram. I didn't read the whole thing because I was right before I hopped on here, but the first paragraph she talked about how she has something wrong with her where she has a low level of hormones and she got prescribed this medication to a doctor, and because of that, she kept she failed certain USADA tests, but then was clean for other ones. I'm not quite sure, but like they've suspended her for like 16 months, and then they did something else, and she was like, they basically forced me into it, so I had to retire from the sport because I can't like I can't afford to like fight this, or can't afford to like stay out of the sport this long. So that was what she put on her Instagram today. So, and I seen a lot of people on Twitter talking about it and saying like it's time that USADA. They were basically saying USADA's done nothing but kind of ruin people's careers. I mean, I don't know where you stand on that, but it does seem like they're being more. They can certainly be like tyrants with certain things like this. I don't know. It's now getting to the point where we're going after people for doing anything, even when it's something to that extent. So it's just, I don't know. It seems a little overboard, all of the testing and all that sort of thing.
My general opinion on this is the fighters shouldn't be in this position at all, the clean or the dirty ones. No one should be in this position because none of the fighters had a say in this. The fighters had no voice at the negotiation table. So all of this stuff with USADA, if someone were to ask me how I truly feel about it, nobody should have to go through this. I don't care what's going on. That's a completely separate conversation. You can't force me to do like how can you force a roster full of over 500 athletes to subject to something and you didn't give them any say in it? And I don't have to bring up the laundry list of fighters that have said they've basically gotten their lives inconvenienced by USADA, let alone the guys that have had to fight arbitration and and it's weird again because USADA's in there, so the sport is clean, but yet the fight can still go down, and the results come out after the fact. So then, it's just all convoluted. And again, like I don't even want to get into the morality of that because I feel like all of USADA's actions are null and void to me ultimately because the fighters had zero say in the matter. It's the same thing with Reebok. My ultimately how I feel about it is like it's not good or bad because we don't really know if the fighters had a say in it. That 2,500 that you give the fighters, would that be 2,500 or would it be 5K? Would it be 7,500? I don't really know. I can't really put a value on sponsorship because the fighters didn't have a say. So I feel the same way with USADA, but that is crazy. So what do you think she should do next? What's really the temperature? Like,
I don't know. I mean, again, I haven't like dived deep into it, but it seems like she's just gonna have to retire. I mean, really, like all she can do at this point. Unless maybe the UFC release her, but then I don't know if her failures with USADA extends to just the commission suspending her. I don't know if she's just suspended by USADA or suspended by USADA and a commission. Because if it was just USADA, the UFC could cut her. She could go to a number of different organizations. She's a former Invicta champion, so I mean, I'm sure a lot of places would be happy to have her, but I don't know if that's possible. So I don't know. I mean, we've seen it before. We've seen stuff like this. They try to take Vanderlei's career away. They basically, they've been that way to. This is the commission, not just USADA, but Diaz has been screwed over this way. So I don't know. It's sad to see someone's career kind of be forced to end over just some USADA stuff, and especially when they've got it wrong so many times with, like, I don't know how they handled the John Jones thing. The Josh Barnett had a huge gripe against him that he was in the right about. Tom Lawler, Tim Means, Anderson Silva, like all these people that there was tainted supplement, Yoel Romero. So it's just, I don't know. It seems like it's done way more harm than it's done good at this point. I think it was an overcorrection for letting people use TRT for that extended amount of time.
Yeah, I just tend to think the UFC was thinking we got to pony this thing up to get ready for the sell, which sort of goes back to the whole, my little mini rant about Lorenzo and wanting to see a 30 for 30 because that would be one of them. Like, that's sort of what the USADA move feels like, because it definitely feels like it was thrown together and not thought out, because it feels like every other month they have to edit the rules because they jacked something up for somebody. And this is just, according to what you're saying, because I haven't actually seen it, but it sounds like this is pretty much just another example of that. And if so, that's extremely unfortunate. So I guess, again, it's a slow week, so just wanted to touch on some little topics. So I guess before we get out of here, one other little topic I want to touch on, Henry Cejudo. Dominic Cruz came out and said that Henry Cejudo cannot be considered the greatest of all time unless he beats me. Thoughts on that?
I don't know that that's entirely true. I mean, if he, like, say he had both titles and he kept defending both back and forth for years, I think might be considered that. I don't think he totally has to. I don't think Cejudo should be considered the greatest fighter for a while. I mean, I don't think he's close to that. So I think he definitely has a lot more to prove, but I don't think he necessarily has to beat Dominic Cruz to prove that. Although I think it would help a lot. Dominic Cruz is definitely one of the greatest bantamweights of all time, so that would definitely help. But if Cejudo does beat Cruz at this point, would he even get the full credit for beating like a prime uh, Dominic Cruz, or would they look at it as a win over a former great who's a little bit past their prime? So I don't know that he needs to, but um, if you're Dominic Cruz, it's the right thing to say, I'm sure.
Yeah, I like Dominic Cruz. He has a penchant for keeping his name in the mix while he's on the shelf. So for him, I do just feel like it's that. And if you're Henry Cejudo, I mean, and this really does feel unfortunate to say, but it does feel like he's kind of playing with house money. It just feels like the UFC and Dana or whoever, no one's really pushing him one way or the other. It just sort of feels like he's just kind of out here. So it's kind of weird, but the thought that he would have to beat Dominic Cruz to be considered the greatest of all time, that feels like a stretch. I'm not gonna lie, just because Dominic Cruz has had so many start stops himself, and I'm sure if he heard me say this, he would talk me up and down and rip my argument apart about how injuries and blah 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 blah. But ultimately, the fans have not seen you on a consistent basis. So for me to sit here and say that if Cejudo doesn't beat you, the man who's been on the shelf for the majority of the past 5 years, I don't like that. Me trying to say that out loud doesn't even make sense and compute properly. I don't really care who you are. I would say the same thing if John Jones was on the shelf for 5 years. And he said the same thing about DC, even though he holds two dubs over him. If he said the same thing but was on the shelf for the majority of the past 5 years, I would feel the exact same way. So no. I like the sentiment though. It sounds good.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And uh, at a time where, especially with Cejudo, it seems like to get that title shot, it kind of just has to be whatever he and Dana White's feeling. It doesn't have to be off of recent wins, or else we'd be talking about or Henry Cejudo would be talking about Peter Yan or Aljamain Sterling, but instead he's talking about guys like Jose Aldo and Dominic Cruz because of those are what he perceives to be the biggest fights for him. So Dominic Cruz obviously wants that fight. He thinks it's a fight he thinks he can win, and that's how you put your name out there to get Henry Cejudo to respond in whatever cringy way that he chooses to do, and then that's how you get that fight. So yeah, Dominic's one of the smartest guys in the game. So yeah, he knows exactly what to do.
It is extremely it's complicated, and I want to just ask this. I guess we'll end it on this. I guess this can be a two-parter. If you're Aljamain Sterling and Peter Yan, and you've got Henry Cejudo, how do you handle that? Where you've got to like both of you could arguably get the title shot. It's clear that everyone's waiting for both of you guys to knock one of the other off. When it is also unnecessary, but it also feels unnecessary, and you have a champion who his hand will not be forced. And then prior to him having to relinquish his belt, it was like you had to throw Joe Benavidez in the mix, so it was even more complicated. So I'm just wondering, I've always wondered that as sort of a symptom of this double champ era. And I just want to sort of throw it to you to end it. What do you think about that? Just sort of the complications and just the log jam that seems like it could just sort of happen where, like, these two guys are sort of at a standstill and the champ doesn't really have to do anything because he's sort of waiting for one of them to make a move. And now both of them are stuck in a weird game of chicken, Aljamain Sterling and Peter Yan, even though he did take a fight recently, which was risky in and of itself. But any sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know that there's anything they really can do. Like, the most you could do is win oppressively in the octagon, and they've both obviously done that, especially Peter Yan against Faber. I mean, that was an incredible fight. So they've done that. Cejudo obviously just wants the bigger fight with a legendary guy, so it'll sell better, I guess, or something to that extent. So I guess you could maybe try to talk trash with them online to, I don't know, to sell the fight that way.
You're Peter Yan or Aljamain Sterling's manager. What do you tell them to do?
I don't know. I mean, I think if you're their managers, you just have to argue with the UFC to get the fight done, to be like, we're the ones that rightfully deserve it. I don't know, because I was going to say what you maybe need to go back and forth with Cejudo online to drum up some interest, but they both tried to do that and it hasn't. It works just the same as Cejudo going back and forth anyway online, but he's kind of picking and choosing right now. And Dana, him and Dana are weirdly on the same page about like Aldo, and even though he lost his last fight. So, yeah, I don't know if there's anything you can do at this point. I mean, I think for sure both of those two are going to have to fight again before getting a fight with Cejudo, because I don't think either one of them are the first or second person in line to fight Cejudo as it stands right now, even though that's what it should be if you went by actual rankings or by recent performances. But I think the UFC and Cejudo would much rather go with Aldo and or Bruce.
Yeah, it's just, and I don't want to belabor the conversation, like, it just rehash shit about, like, oh, the hierarchy and what does that mean. I feel like we spent all last year talking about that. So I just wanted to rephrase it and just, like, if you're a manager, like, you got to maneuver these waters. What do you tell these guys to do? And I wasn't, not sitting there asking for a Nostradamus answer, because I have no idea what I would tell these guys to do, other than either fight or sit on your hands and just wait. Like, I don't know how you maneuver the waters when you have a guy that earned it, but at the same time, there is a clear log jam. These guys are athletes, so, they win 5-6 in a row. They feel like, hey, where's my title shot? And they're looking at you, manager X. And it's just like, what do you really do besides tell the guy you might just have to lace up for one more and hope you come out on the other side? Like, I don't know. It's just messy. But yeah, I guess I don't really know what I would tell a fighter to do. I just wanted to sort of get that out there, because it's just weird with this double champ, triple champ era that we're just heading in. I just feel like these problems are going to come up more and more over time. Like, look at lightweight. We're just now starting to get the wheels turning. So yeah, I guess that was it for me as far as topics. Was there anything you wanted to get to before we get out of here? Anything under the radar? Any fights you feel like we missed? Anything at all?
No, I think we basically covered everything.
All right, so before we get out of here, Austin, let the people know where they can find you. Social media, websites, anything like that at all.
Yeah, on Twitter at MMAPanic, and the website is MMAPanic.com.
All right, you heard it there. You can find Austin on Twitter at MMAPanic. Find me on Twitter at Nixon_speaks. And as always, I'll see you guys later on in the week.